Hello and welcome to an update about the Infinity N5 version 1.1 rules update. Corvus Belli have just dropped the first significant update to the N5 rules system, along with a small update to Army that reflects some of the changes made in the rules, not a significant balance change, just changes to profiles to accommodate how certain rules have changed, and we're going to jump in and walk through that. Now, what we're going to be covering is all of the significant rules changes and the minor ones, talking about what is the change and what does it mean. So the things that we'll be going through are changes to turrets, changes to the Speedball mechanic, changes to climbing and jumping and the associated super jump and climbing plus skills, the new ITS mid-seasonal stealth operations rule, and then just other small changes, including talking about at least one thing that's kind of conspicuously absent from this update. This will be primarily an explainer video, as well as giving you some things that maybe you might want to think about in terms of how your lists or your play might change as a result of these rules changes, because some of them are quite significant. To get my qualitative take out of the way first though, what's the vibes check? The vibes check is this is a very good update with pretty much few to no unwelcome changes. There were some very powerful rules that have been reined in slightly, but unless you are like an extreme super jump enjoyer who had gotten very used to how N5 super jump worked and the extreme mobility that it offered, you are probably overall going to like the changes to the game that this rules update has brought about. And if you're like me, you'll be very much looking forward to the release of the N5 wiki, which I understand basically was waiting for this update to drop. So, first and most significant change, the turret nerf. What's the rules change? The rules change is that turrets have gained a trait called non-reloadable, which is explained in the rulebook, but it is exactly what you would think. You can no longer reload turrets. Now, this is something that I've talked about in other videos, and which I've covered, for example, in the vibes check video that I've done previously about N5 and how I thought it was going. But there was a very powerful tactic that you could previously employ, which everyone watching this video will probably be familiar with, which is that you could use baggage to reload models that expended their turret and place more turrets. Typically, you would use the free reload at the end of turn in the states phase to get this reload, which would usually enable a model with turrets to place 2 or 3 in a game, but you could also actively reload by spending an order and then place a turret and then actively reload and then place a turret, etc. Now, the specific problem around this was not actually really with the difficulty of removing an individual turret by gunfighting it or using a deactivator, etc. Because most turrets are not particularly good at gunfighting. The problem that tended to arise was that, firstly, once you started placing enough turrets, sooner or later, some of those turrets would start getting lucky. Even though a turret is not particularly good at ARO, most turrets have got very restricted range bands. All turrets are only ballistic skill 10, etc. But sooner or later, you're going to be forced to engage a turret inside a range band where it can hit, and if it can hit, it can crit, which means that sooner or later, the volume of dice caused by lots and lots of turrets is going to produce situations where they get lucky. And secondly, it takes usually a minimum of 1 order to clear a turret. Sometimes it takes more when they get lucky. If for whatever reason you can't deal with a turret the turn your opponent placed it, you would have to leave it, and then they would get to place more. And what it would do is it would create a problem that I called defensive debt, which is that you would reach a state toward the end of the game where you simply did not have enough orders to clear all of the defensive turrets your opponent had placed and still do whatever it was you needed to do to win the game. Now, I would generally note that both of these problems materializing was rare, right? I would observe them in only a small proportion of games, even when I was actively trying to make maximal use of turrets, but there is a difference between rare and non-existent, and the situations where turrets felt really bad, they felt really bad. And so it's not particularly surprising that turrets are one of the things, first off the bat, being looked at in the 1.1 rules update. So what is the effect of this change? Well, in short, this is probably the most single heavy-handed nerf they could have done to turrets. Not being able to reload them means that you get 1 turret a game maximum, and this actually pretty significantly affects the value proposition. I am kind of the opinion that most turrets will now arguably not be worth the cost, because your average turret costs 2 to 3 points and costs an order to place and usually only takes 1 order to kill. Now, When that trade is being made multiple times in a game, and those 2 to 3 points gets abrogated over multiple turrets, and you start having that situation, that chance where your turrets get lucky and the defensive debt builds up, then turrets could well be worth those 2 to 3 points. But now they're only kind of maybe worth the cost, given that the most common exchange is that you spend 2 to 3 points and an order, and your opponent spends an order. I kind of feel like I don't have to explain why that's not necessarily the best exchange. And so, in terms of how you want to think about list construction now, where I would be going is there basically aren't any models in the game anymore that are only good because they have a good turret. Now, for a model with a turret to be good, it has to be a good model that coincidentally has a turret. So to give an example in O12 that is on my mind, O12 has two models with access to Thunderbolt turrets. Thunderbolt turrets before this change were probably my favorite ones because it's basically impossible to outrange a Thunderbolt turret, which means that they are almost always getting +3 range band, which means they're almost always able to hit, which increases, even with Burst 2, increases your chances of the turret getting lucky over the course of a game. Now, there were two profiles that you could reach for if you wanted a Thunderbolt turret in O12. The first was a Psychop, MSV1, Mimetism, Multi-Marksman Rifle. Multi-Marksman Rifle is not the best gun in the game, its damage is not particularly high, but a Psychop is a fine piece, and paying a few extra points for a Thunderbolt turret, not a bad call. The secondary option that you have, if you want a better quality turret, you can access an AP Thunderbolt turret on a Jackboot. However, jackboots are kind of trash. They're not nearly as high utility as that Psychop. They don't do nearly as much. That jackboot profile is not going to be gunfighting, etc. So the Psychop, even though it has a worse turret in absolute terms, they are both Thunderbolt turrets, but the jackboot has armor piercing. The Psychop is a piece that you can put in a list and have do something, whereas the jackboot kind of isn't. And so, well, look, frankly, before I was using Psychops because I like putting good models in list and I don't like putting bad models in list. But now that comparison is very, very clear. The Jackboot is just not particularly great for the cost, and having one single-use AP Thunderbolt turret does not make it a good profile. The Psychop, on the other hand, that Psychop Marksman Rifle MSV profile is just about good enough. It has some good links. It gunfights just well enough if you don't need it to fight really high armor. That you can consider it, and since you can consider it on its own merits, maybe you find a few points to also take the profile that has the Thunderbolt turret. Those are the kind of things that you'll be looking at now that turrets aren't reloadable. And then, in play, you're looking to find a way to minimize the opportunity cost of placing them. Placing a turret when you don't have any other use for that second short skill means that the cost of spending an order begins to become less. Perhaps you were moving anyway, you only needed to move one short skill. Okay, cool, we'll use your second short skill to place a turret in a good spot. We haven't really lost an order doing that. We've only spent a few points to upgrade an already good profile to have a turret, and we have a turret that might do something. They are overall going to be much lower impact in games, and particularly models with turrets that have got those more constrained range bands will not be able to just throw them out somewhere that your opponent will be able to easily put them in a -3. So if you are taking, for example, an engineer profile with a combi armed turret, those combi rifle range bands have to be deployed judiciously. You are just going to waste that piece if you chuck it up in a tower somewhere where it is only taking shots out at 30 inches. Overall, this is basically the most nuclear option short of removing turrets from the game entirely, which would have been a terrible tragedy because I think turrets conceptually are super awesome. And we're probably going to see a precipitous drop in their use for that reason. It's possible that we'll see some further tuning over the course of time. For example, I think Corvus Belli could now very easily put more Mine Layer profiles out, even though Mine Layer is no longer a particularly good skill to combine with a turret because you can't afford to just leave a turret in your deployment zone. You need to place it where it's guaranteed to do something. But I also think they could potentially afford to either maybe up the stats of turrets very slightly, or potentially make them a little bit cheaper. 2 to 3 points is not that expensive, but this is a single-use piece of equipment, and I can't, for example, in good conscience say that one non-reloadable turret is going to be higher impact than shock mines, and shock mines cost, generally speaking, 1 point on a profile. I feel like armed turrets should be brought down more to that kind of cost, which is 1 point per average per model, but that's probably where I would be leaning towards adjusting the balance on turrets just to make them a little bit more accessible. They can also afford, if they want to put more good turrets on good profiles, because there's really not any risk of a model becoming broken by having a turret added to it, because the turret is only going to be a single use, it only has to be sold by an opponent once, etc. Overall, I think more people are going to be happy about this than not. I personally am going to miss spamming out turrets because it's the kind of tactic that I like to use. However, I am comfortable with this overall being a change that is healthy for the game, and the people who are grateful to see this change are really very grateful to see this change. Up next, the Speedball nerf. So, what is the change? The change is that Vitapack, auto repairs, and switch on no longer trigger automatically on the trooper that is holding them. Instead, they can only be used by spending a short skill on an allied, unconscious, immobilized, isolated, or stunned trooper that you're in silhouette contact with. This means, for example, in most cases, if you have an unconscious model that you want to recover, you need to have someone else call down the Speedball, request the Vitapack, pick up the Vitapack, and apply it to the unconscious model to reconstitute them, rather than having it revive someone the second that they go down. So, what does this mean? Well, it means that preventative speedballs, that is to say, the tactic that most people were using speedballs for, where you would call down something like a switch on or one of the healing speedballs, give it to a model that you were sending into harm's way in the knowledge that it would automatically trigger if they took damage or got stunned, immobilized, isolated, etc., just is not a thing anymore. There is no longer any reason to call down a speedball until you need it, which means that the main use of speedballs is for force reconstitution later in the game. You can't really use them as a significant contributor to an alpha strike, except maybe for potentially saving a disastrous alpha strike, and even then you're going to need other models on site to do the healing or the switch on or etc., which means that solo alpha Rambo style, particularly hackable Rambo style alpha strike pieces, models like Norkias, are most affected by this change. You can no longer have Norkias activate, pick up a speedball as part of his first order so that he has switch on present, and then YOLO him through a hacking area, taking fights as he goes, hoping that the switch on will trigger if he gets isolated. Now he will need someone nearby to recover him from the isolated state. He can't do that himself because if he gets isolated, he won't have the order. There needs to be a model nearby who can spend the order to recover him. Now, just on that, something to note. Corvus Belli, in their blog post about this, stated that the speedball change was to have them not benefit the holder. But rules as written, troopers can still use all of these changed speedballs on themselves by spending a short skill. So, for example, a model with no wound incapacitation could use a Vitapack on themselves in the same way that a doctor in no wound incapacitation can heal themselves. A model in the isolated state could spend its own irregular order to pick up a speedball and apply it to themselves, because troopers are always in silhouette contact with themselves. And the rules around Speedball do talk about allied troopers, but the N5 rule system just uses allied troopers to mean troopers under the control of the player. Now, that use case is going to be rare, but we should keep it in mind. Most of the time, though, what you're going to use a speedball for, if you've got one up your sleeve, is you're going to call them down kind of as a substitute for having a doctor or an engineer. It's going to make fire teams that have a surviving member nearby able to recover a downed piece that was previously part of the fire team. Or if you've lost models in your deployment zone, then anything you have nearby might be able to call down a speedball, pick it up, apply it to that trooper, and recover a game piece without making a die roll, as a kind of once per game substitute for having a doctor or an engineer in the right place at the right time. Now, what this kind of means is that, look, Speedball is still going to be a fine use of a command token for many lists, particularly lists that otherwise have surplus command tokens. You can use it as a substitution for a doctor or an engineer. You can also potentially use it as a substitution for baggage in some lists, because there is a speedball you can call down that reloads a trooper. But not every list is going to need or be able to make use of this. And that means that, given that Speedball still requires you spend a command token as the game begins to have access to it at any point during the game, that decision might be quite difficult to make ahead of time. My suggestion would probably generally be, if you have surplus command tokens, if you're not doing things like having command tokens up your sleeve to reroll engineer or doctor rolls, if you don't expect to have to turn many irregular orders regular, if in your experience the list you are playing generally has surplus command tokens by the end of the game, well, you may as well go ahead and spend the speedball. And otherwise, use it if you think that you're going to get benefit from that once per game, bringing one thing back by calling down either a Vita Pack or auto repairs. Once you have that Speedball, if you've decided to spend the command token, then don't call it down until you need it, because there's really no benefit to calling down a Speedball in a preventative sense. The only very slight niche case where you might call one down ahead of time is if you're calling a duo into danger. If you're spending a duo into danger and you really strongly suspect that they are going to need a Speedball, and you don't want to risk the drop failing, then you can call one down. If they're near a table edge in your deployment zone, then you can call one down. If the Speedball fails, it will land near the deployment zone, and you can use it to automatically pick it up because it's on your DZ edge. That's the only time you might ever currently call a Speedball down ahead of needing it, just because you might want to slightly avoid the risk of one failing to land in the midfield when you need it. But most of the time, keep your Speedballs, up your sleeves until you have a model that you need to recover using Vitapack Auto Repair or Switch On, because those are the most powerful Speedballs still. And probably don't use the command token to have access to Speedball at all if those aren't things that you need. If your list doesn't include, or you're not playing against things that can isolate or immobilize you, if you don't really expect to get use out of Vitapack or Auto Repair, and especially if you have other high value ways of spending your command tokens, you only get 4, sometimes 5. And if you're, for example, a Pan-Oceanian player with a tag playing against a hacking enemy, it might be very tempting to have access to Speedball. But if you're going second and you've spent one command token to strip orders and you spend another command token to have access to Speedball, you have 2 command tokens left. And 2 command tokens is a very shallow pool to both do things like reroll failed engineering rolls on your tag and depossess your tag at the beginning of a turn if it gets possessed. My strong rule of thumb, if I'm playing with a tag against hacking, is to never spend that last command token if there is a chance I will need it at any point at the beginning of any turn to cancel possession. And so that, in practice, leaves you with a single command token for the entire game if you are calling down Speedball and stripping orders and reserving one tag for emergency possession counseling. And if your opponent then goes and possesses you at some point on turn 1 or turn 2, you start putting yourself at extreme risk and having to do things like manually use a hacker to try and repossess your tag, which is an option in which you can do, but it's really not optimal. So, with respect to these changes, be careful calling down Speedball. Really think about whether or not you need it. It will be a tactical decision that you will need to make based on your read of the game state and your experience with your list. Probably do some experimentation. Even if you don't call down a Speedball, if you play a couple of games with a list and you just don't use Speedball at all, check and see, hey, how many command tokens did you have at the end of each game? Was the answer 1 or more, or was it 0? Were you using all of those command tokens productively? What would have happened if you hadn't spent any, or if you had spent all of them? Just do that kind of testing to see, if you're not sure, hey, is this a list that warrants calling down Speedball or not? Is this a list that can reconstitute force, or even wants to reconstitute force? We will need to learn how to use this mechanic because it has considerably changed. It is no longer in any way easy to use. It requires some tactical foresight and other resources in place to maximize it. Those weren't true before. You could basically always safely call down preventative Speedballs on the first turn and have a pretty good chance of getting maximal use out of them, which is no longer the case. I would also note, just as a small aside, that it's a little bit hilarious how this plus another small change interacts with the aerial trooper type. Before this most recent update, very small change that was made to aerial was that the language around things that aerial troops can't be in contact with has expanded to be all-encompassing. It includes things like game elements now. That wasn't the case before, and the best reading that we had locally was that, yeah, probably an aerial trooper could pick up a Speedball, which means that if an aerial trooper got isolated or immobilized or both, the Speedball could help recover it. This is no longer the case. Firstly, because the aerial rule has changed, very, very small change. But secondly, because even if it hadn't changed, if it didn't already have a Speedball, it's not like someone who picked up a switch on could touch the aerial trooper to activate the Speedball. So now, if you are playing against flying vehicles, then you can always consider that mobility kills could be very strong against them. It's generally easy to kill vehicles the normal way because they're hugely vulnerable. But if the terrain on the table enables your opponent to hide them, they're prioritizing the safety of their vehicles. Remember that you still have the option of dropping a pitcher, isolating and immobilizing them, and just bricking them, and that it is completely impossible for an engineer to repair those states on a vehicle because all aerial vehicles can't be contacted by an engineer. The engineer can't physically get into silhouette contact. They are forced to just sit there floating in the sky trying to reset on ones once every turn. Hilarious. Next up, we have the first of two mobility skills who have been reworked. The first is the changes to jumping, but we'll talk about this also in the context of the changes to climbing. Jumping and climbing now no longer have a fixed 6-inch distance. Instead, both now move your first move value plus 2 inches. So a trooper that has a 4-4 move will climb or jump 6 inches. A trooper that is a 6-2 move will climb or jump 8 inches. In addition, super jump can now only be used as the first short skill of an order. So a trooper with super jump can no longer jump as an order. In addition, some models that used to have, for example, super jump 8 inches or jump 8 inches have received a modifier that replaces that flat plus 2 inches with a flat plus 3 inches. So for example, Quarige, who are 6'2 with super jump, used to have super jump 8 inches. Now they have super jump 3 inches, which gives them plus 3 inches to their first move value when declaring a jump. Now, what does this mean? Okay, the big change, the big thing here is actually that super jump can only be used as the first short skill of an order. The fact that you can't jump is the most significant change here, because it means that even though models with super jump are still always faster in absolute terms than if they didn't have that skill, because they can declare jump and get 2 inches of extra movement on their first move, that's it. That's all that they get. Which means that, in general, models using super jump to traverse long distances will always be moving at least 2 inches slower per entire order than they would have been moving previously. This means models like Norcaius and Lankai, etc., like those really Naruto running across the field, extreme speed, closing distances extremely quickly. Things like Quarige links, for example, who could go 16 inches an order, depending on how you chose to read the jump skill, right? Covering that massive distance, moving out, striking, and retreating, for example. All of that will now take more orders. However, equally, in quite a lot of cases, you do get a little bit more front-loaded movement. So for example, Quarige used to jump 8 inches as the first order and 8 inches as the second. Now they jump 9 inches as the first order, but can only move 2 inches as their second. That's a significant overall reduction in mobility, but it does increase your striking range with a single order if you can make maximal use of that long jump. Things like Hollow Men, for example, no longer go 6 inches and then 6 inches again. Now they go 8 inches and then 2 inches again. But if they are using that second short skill regularly for something else, for example, a Hollow Man link with Perseus, the link jumps, Perseus throws smoke. The link jumps, a Hollow Man shoots a pitcher. If you are moving the link around that way, making use of your second short skill each order to do something productive, you are actually going to be quicker, just a little bit quicker, on some models in the link than you would have been previously, performing all of the same moves. Now, you probably wouldn't have performed all of the same moves as often previously because that Hollow Man link could go 6/6 on every model, every order, which was a huge amount of forward and backwards mobility as you needed, but it is something to consider that many models have this striking range in a single order increased, no more so than vehicles. Vehicles are the most heavily affected trooper by this change, but it's not an entirely negative change. Basically, every vehicle is 8'2 with super jump, importantly with jet propulsion, which means that you don't have to worry about straight line movement. Now, before, all vehicles could move, again, depending on how you chose to read the super jump skills, but let's just go with 8 inches super jump first order, jet propulsion, perfect mobility, and then 8 inches second short skill. So vehicles could move 16 inches in an order, which was extremely far. They can no longer do so, but they now effectively move 11 inches with the first order, just only 2 with the second. Now that's 3 inches less of movement if you spend the order moving, for example, trying to reposition, aggressively push toward your opponent, maybe get inflood fire down their deployment zone. But you have 3 inches more striking range inside a single order. If you are trying to hit someone with a super jump, move, and shoot just in one order, you can now go 3 inches further, which is actually really very significant. Even if we just consider the pop-up, pop-down vertical mobility, when you combine that 11 inches 5.5 up, 5.5 back, with the basic height of a Silhouette 7 Trooper, a vehicle can pop up something like 8.2 inches and draw line of sight from the top of their silhouette, which is a really significant height to actually have on top of wherever they are standing. So in case you weren't already aware, be aware of the pop-up, pop-down, plunging fire potential from vehicles. Be aware that a vehicle that starts in one location might actually be able to threaten quite a long distance away from that location in a single order, even if their mobility overall will be somewhat more constrained. Moving 13 inches in an order is still nice and fast, but it is obviously a lot less than moving 16 inches in an order. Now, the last thing to note is actually that delta between super jump with jet propulsion and super jump without. If you have jet propulsion, well and good, you have perfect unrestricted mobility, you can make full use of however long that jump might be. A vehicle can make full use of that 11 inches with no concerns about the fact that it's straight line movement. If you just have normal super jump and have a model that has gone from being able to jump 6'6" to a model that has been able to go maybe 9 inches, right? Something like a Quarige, which can go 9 inches, or models like Holomen, which can go 8 inches in a super jump, just be aware that that is not necessarily in absolute terms a pure +2 increase in your striking distance, because jumping is not the same as unrestricted movement. It's straight line movement, even with a very liberal interpretation of how parabolic movement works. There are going to be people who kind of reasonably make the argument that even though a super jump can move in a parabola, that parabola shouldn't be able to curve horizontally around a corner, for example. Even if you play super jump as being able to curve parabolically around a corner, i.e. not just a parabola that curves along the vertical axis, it's often still difficult on some tables to make full use all the time of those really long individual movement distances. There are plenty of tables and situations that I have played on where a 9-inch jump, for example, is not something I can fully utilize. This is actually something that I've been playing around with before this skill change, trying to see how I can make use of models, for example, with super jump 8 inches. And while from personal experience, having 8 inches is really, really nice, there are still inevitably going to be circumstances where you can't make full use of it, and it's an inch more than you might need for any given task that you're putting it to. Now, I've just mentally been confronted with the consequences of that sentence I just uttered, which I'm going to deal with by not addressing it at all, and move on to climbing plus. So the second mobility skill rework change, and one that is quite consistent with super jump, is that climbing is no longer fixed at 6 inches, and now instead moves your first move value plus 2 inches. This doesn't really change many things for many models. Sometimes you'll be able to climb to a slightly higher surface. The much more significant change here is to climbing plus, which has regained the old N4 climbing plus ability to move normally on vertical surfaces as if they were horizontal surfaces using your normal movement. A model with climbing plus can also declare climb as a short skill, as the first short skill of the order only, consistent with the super jump changes, but it's that second thing where you can just move on vertical surfaces that is the really big change. Old climbing plus is back. This is a surprise, but it's a very welcome one. Basically, every climbing plus model who has spent the last 4 months envious of models with super jump is now back on a fairly even footing. I would probably make the argument that super jump is probably still the slightly better skill. It does still translate to more actual movement distance. Jump is kind of a more flexible skill much of the time, but not always, and not by such a huge margin. Lots of models like Sujans and Bearpods and Hungaries, etc., are all very obvious beneficiaries. Kahu, for example. There are lots of profiles in the game that have climbing plus and were like, I guess it's nice to have this, but we're good on our own merits, right? Sujan were good on their own merits. Kahu were good on their own merits. Now they're a little bit better because climbing plus has that extra level of flexibility. Sphinx are probably still not good, but they are marginally less bad than they were before. Now, tragically, it is still not possible under N5 rules to combine super jump and climbing plus to super jump onto a vertical surface. So models like Shakami and Bishia, for example, can't start on ground level and then jump onto a wall, even though that would be rad as fuck. because the jump rules still require that you land on a horizontal surface, and the way that interfaces with the climbing plus rules doesn't quite enable enough wiggle room for you to move around, jumping onto horizontal surfaces, etc. It's not quite there. Now, if you were to just hand wave that and house roll it, nobody would blame you, but it is something that is still just a very small gap for those few models that have both of those skills. Just be aware of it if you're playing it. Those models will still be very, very mobile, able to really live the mobility armor kind of fantasy. Now, we're getting down now into the weeds and the lower impact changes. These ones that we've covered so far were all of the most significant ones. However, one that is likely to impact some games is the change to what we would previously call limited insertion, strategic use of command tokens, where now you cannot spend command tokens to strip orders from an army list that has 10 or fewer total regular, irregular, or tactical orders in their order pool after the first order count. Now, this is a change to how the rule works, because previously this rule already existed. It was in N5, but the language that it used was orders in the army list. And there is a difference between orders in the army list and orders in the order pool, because models with hidden and airborne deployment still generate an order, they just don't add it to the order pool. It's kept secret, it's kept safe. It's not public to your opponent, but it still exists. Because the previous wording on this said orders in your army list, if you had, for example, multiple models in hidden deployment, but 10 total regular, irregular, and tactical orders visible to your opponent, they could still strip orders from you. Now they can't. So the obvious use case is if you have a list that only generates 10 regular orders, but has lots of models hidden, deployed, airborne, etc., that's the kind of list that will make use of this. Now, my contention is that most lists will still not generally benefit from trying to make use of this rule. Trying to take a list and shoehorn that many hidden deployment pieces, etc., into the list, reducing your order count on the first turn down so much, it is just difficult to make a really significant dent in your opponent to launch a really significant attack with only 10 orders. And so most of the time, playing to this rule is not really a significant advantage. However, there will be some factions that make genuinely good use of genuinely good quality hidden troops in large numbers. There are Hassassin Baram lists, for example, that are able to combine things like Hassassin Shujay and Hassassin AR, and who aren't running that many tactical awareness orders, that might actually be able to just slightly tinker with their loadout and make good use of this change. However, generally, my advice is probably don't try and build for this unless you have a specific plan or a specific meme in mind. On top of that, if you already have access to counterintelligence, if you have easy counterintelligence access in your list, then really yanking your list construction around to get just one extra order on the first turn is obviously kind of foolish. And I say this because I know that right now there are Kestrel players out there who have easy access to counterintelligence via the Magistrate who are still considering running maximum availability of Blink Team and Banshees to make use of this change. You know who you are, stop it, it's not good, and don't tell other people to do it. Just take the counterintelligence model and build a good normal list with a good normal number of hidden or airborne deployment pieces. Don't try and stretch yourself to make use of this. Instead, if you organically arrive at a situation where it's good, consider how you might maybe make that last change to take advantage of this. It's only literally if you were otherwise going to begin your first turn with 10 regular, irregular, or tactical orders, you might consider making a list change to bring that down, right, from 11 down to 10. But if you have access to counterintelligence already, or you are running a list that has 13 regular, irregular, and tactical orders, don't try and yank the list around until it gets down to that 10 or below number. It's probably not going to make an overall better list, although it might make a very funny list because that much hidden and airborne deployment can be quite fun to play with. Now, just to cover the last possibly significant change before we get into the little nitty-gritty last few things, there is an ITS mid-seasonal rule, stealth operations. This applies to all scenarios. It's an ITS seasonal rule, and what you do is at the beginning of the game, pick a model that is on the table, always on the table as a model, not as a marker, that is not a rem, tag, vehicle, or motorcycle, to gain the stealth and silence pistol rules. What does this mean? I mean, look, stealth is obviously high value. There are lots and lots of heavy infantry models that will benefit from stealth in terms of being able to just, move through enemy hacking networks, for example. Yep, it's time for stealth Suijans, just to give one example. You can also potentially use this to give models that don't otherwise have a normal ballistic skill attack weapon, things like Hungries, you can give them a pistol. And frankly, silenced pistols are not a terrible gun. They are effectively breaker pistols with shock ammunition, damage 8. They deal a save against half your opponent's BTS, and they have the shock property. And because it's half BTS, models with immunity armor, looking at you, Norkias, aren't immune to the shock effect. So the fact that every army in the game is going to have at least one model with a silenced pistol might cause Norkias to sweat a little bit. But most of the models that you might choose to give that silenced pistol to will either already have a good sidearm and the silenced pistol is just an occasional use for the purposes of being a silenced weapon, or it's to give a model that's not actually good at gunfighting a gun of some sort. Now, there are a few biological peripherals, so things that aren't rems, tags, vehicles, or motorcycles, that you can give this to get some interesting effects out of. Things like Symbio Beasts or the Toha Chaxa peripherals that actually qualify to be given a gun. Most of them have pretty mediocre ballistic skill, but it is something to bear in mind if, for example, you're a Toha player. Now, tragically, while you can technically give a gun to a Netrod, you can't really create the Claymore Roomba style armed Netrod because Netrods don't have a ballistic skill score, so they can't actually make ballistic skill attacks. So even though it is technically possible to strap a gun to the top of your Wi-Fi extender, it doesn't actually do anything, it's just for style points. Now, finally, just to move through a few other small changes to rules that are worth kind of calling out, probably the most significant is the Ferroware update. Firstly, they've just cleaned up Ferroware. Ferroware was previously referred to as a technical weapon, which N3 and N4 players will know what that means, but it's not actually a term that exists in N5 other than in Ferroware. Ferroware attacks are now all correctly referred to as ballistic skill willpower weapons, comms attacks, yada yada. That's all just cleaning up and making clear how they're supposed to work. We all knew how they worked already. The more significant change is that Endgame has gone from Burst 2 to Burst 1 double shot. Now, what that previously, a Burst 2 disposable weapon, right? Any use of the weapon, whether it was firing Burst 2 in active or Burst 1 in reactive, consumed 1 disposable charge. Double shot consumes both disposable charges, which means that if you blow your full load with Endgame, each time you use it in active turn, you only get that one use of it before it's unloaded, and you have to reload it with, say, a Chaxa, for example. This means that the double shot is optional, so this means that you might, if you're a Toha player, choose to voluntarily limit your burst to get 2 uses of it. Remember, Ferroware is a ballistic skill willpower weapon, which means that it benefits from +1 special die from linked teams. So you can effectively get 2 shots and then 2 shots. It's just that you're rolling with special dies there, and so you can only score 1 hit per attack. In ARO, it's unchanged because you're only burst 1 anyway. You can't use double shot in ARO, so it's unchanged in reactive turn. Now, from the experience of Toha players who I've consulted with who have had games with this change already, it's a bit of a blow. Endgame was one of Toha's signature effects, not the only thing that makes Toha unique and powerful, but it's one of the really good things about Toha, and it's now much harder to make use of. You can still throw it out with Symbio Bombs to full effect, you didn't care about that anyway, Symbio Bombs were always one use, but particularly tack wheel officers are finding their use cases more and more restricted. They are still a good lieutenant or chain of command profile. They still have access to Mirror Ball, which is possibly one of the most powerful effects in the entire game because it allows you to generate 0 visibility, eclipse zones in zone of control without line of sight, which is literally the best visibility tool in the entire game, bar none. There is nothing in the game that remotely compares to a +1 special die willpower 14 Mirror Ball, but that's now much more the niche of the tack wheel officer. Now, I think overall, these rules changes collectively have not left Toha in a worse space because, yes, there is this change to endgame, but if we look at how Toha lists tend to be constructed, they are not in any significant way affected by the change to Jumping or Climbing Plus, and realistically, Toha were not a faction that Toha have no turrets. There are no armed turrets in Toha. There should be, but there aren't. And Toha were not a faction that liked to have to clear through turrets over and over and over, because all it takes is for one of those turrets to get a lucky crit, which triggers and consumes a symbiote that you really wanted to save for something else, waste your time, waste your orders, etc. So Toha no longer having to deal with turret spam and not being materially affected by the changes, for example, to jump and coming plus, I think overall means that they're still in about the same position that they were. This is not a net negative to them, but this is something to bear in mind in terms of Toha lists. In terms of other random stuff, cautious movement has technically been changed. The change is that models with hidden deployment can't react using an ARO because they're not on the table as a model or a marker. This will sometimes be relevant. The number of reserves that you have is now public. Now, my recollection is that this was a rule in N4. So hey, it's just being reintroduced. It's a nice change. I actually think I was already asking people about this because most of the time it's public in any case, but just for clarity, if you have Strategos, if you spent a command token, if you've got some other rule, it's now just always public information how many reserves you have prior to deploying them. There are also clarifications to skills like MSV3 and Nanoscreen, but if I'm being blunt, you, the audience, either already understand what the interaction was that needs to be changed, or it will never have impacted your game in the first place. Most people would never have been impacted by the fact that, technically speaking, an Asura with an MSV3 was allowed to declare hacking attacks against camouflage markers because of some looseness in the MSV3 wording. This is probably your first time hearing that. And no worries, because now it's gone. They've cleaned up the MSV3 wording. They've cleaned up a few things about how Nanoscreen works. Nanoscreen works against templates, doesn't work against comms attacks, hunky-dory. Like, this is all very minor stuff. Really nothing else in the minor skill changes is all just to make skills work how we basically thought they would work already. Now, that's all of the changes. Just while we're on this slide, before we wrap the video up, there was one thing I did want to mention, which is the only thing I would consider notably absent, which is any change at all to pitches. Now, my personal philosophy is to deal with the game as it is. I don't really wish list particularly much. I much prefer to play with the tools in front of me. It's just very easy to make yourself upset thinking about how the game should be when the game isn't that way. But I will note that of the many people that I have talked to, probably the only change that I would say was commonly expressed as desirable, but which did not make its way into this rules update, was any change to pitches. In N4 through to N5, pitcher range bands were extended to have a 0 range band all the way out to 24 inches, which, yes, technically has made shots at shorter range less accurate, but it really significantly extended the range at which it was practical to land a pitcher. It's effectively going from 16 to 24 inches to have a range in which you can reasonably hit, particularly with special die, meant that pitchers in N5 received a 50% range increase, which made certain hacking plays and extreme network projection options just hugely viable. Now, this is something that seems to have had an ongoing mixed, not negative, right, mixed reception, but it remains in the game for now, and we can probably assume will just continue to stay in the game, given that it seems pretty likely Corvus Belli would have been aware of this. In fact, I think it's very likely that they received feedback about this during playtesting, and if it was not addressed then, it's intentional, it's a feature, not a bug, so we can pretty reasonably assume that, yep, N5 pitches are N5 pitches. And with that, we're done. That's all of the rules changes that I considered worth talking about. Again, there are some minor minutiae things to how examples are given in the rulebook, etc., but we have covered everything that is important in this video. If you think that I've missed anything, if you think I've missed some implications, please do mention it in the comments. People do seem to read those, and your contributions are, as always, valuable. Otherwise, if you'd like to support the channel, as a reminder, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member. Big thanks to everyone who has on YouTube and via Buy Me a Coffee so far. That wraps up the video for this week, but we will be back next week with battle reports, faction focuses, etc. More Infinity content coming your way. As always, I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.